In a freezing winter village, a devoted husband is discovered inexplicably stripped to his underwear beside a tainted cup of tea. The doors remain securely locked, leaving the only witness as a terrified man whispering about a massive black ghost. What truly stepped out of the shadows that night? Please like and subscribe to join us on this case. This video contains chilling secrets. Viewer discretion is advised. Guizhou Province, located in the southwestern region of China, is widely celebrated for its breathtaking landscapes, towering modern infrastructure, and vibrant spring seasons. Each year, tens of thousands of tourists flock to the area to witness the spectacular cherry blossoms that paint the valleys in brilliant shades of pink and white. However, our focus today is not on the natural beauty of this region. Instead, we are delving into a dark, complex murder investigation that unfolded in a quiet corner of this province over 2 decades ago. It is a case that, when examined through the lens of criminal psychology and forensic science, reveals a tragic and deeply disturbing narrative of human desperation and betrayal. The story begins in the spring of 2003, specifically within Mu'er Village, a small, tight-knit rural community situated in Guizhou town of the Huaxi district. The weather was unusually pleasant for the early months of the year. The crisp, cool morning air carried the scent of blooming cherry trees, creating an idyllic atmosphere. By all outward appearances, it was a perfect day. The residents of Mu'er Village were early risers, and by dawn, most of the neighborhood was already awake, preparing for long hours of agricultural and factory work. At exactly 6 a.m. on the morning of February 24th, 2003, the Li family was gathered in their dining room. From the elderly grandparents to the youngest children, they were sitting together, eating a warm breakfast before starting their day. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the peaceful morning. The sound originated from the house right next door. The eldest son of the family, Li Miexen, immediately dropped his chopsticks, sprang to his feet, and sprinted out the door toward his neighbor's courtyard to investigate the source of the horrific noise. When Li Miexen crossed the threshold into the neighboring living room, he was met with a scene that would forever be seared into his memory. Lying flat on the wooden floor was the male homeowner, 37-year-old Su Yuji. His eyes were bulging wide open, staring blankly toward the ceiling in a horrifying expression of ultimate agony. Thick, white foam had spilled from the corners of his mouth and dried against his cheeks. Beside him sat his 29-year-old wife, Liao Minchu. She was collapsed on her knees, her entire body trembling violently as she sobbed over her husband's remains. Sitting just about 6 feet away was the victim's 33-year-old younger brother, Su Yuda. He appeared to be in a dazed, semi-conscious state, rocking back and forth and muttering incoherently to himself. Within moments, other villagers who had heard the scream rushed into the house. Faced with the macabre tableau, they immediately contacted emergency medical services and the local law enforcement. Just 10 minutes later, officers from the Huaxi District Police Department arrived at the residence. The paramedics who accompanied them quickly confirmed what everyone already suspected. Calling an ambulance was a futile gesture. Su Yuji had been dead for several hours. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in, and his body was cold to the touch. In an instant, the tranquil illusion of Mu'er Village was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a homicide investigation. The police immediately secured the premises, establishing a hard perimeter to preserve the integrity of the crime scene. As the early morning mist dissipated and the sun rose higher, casting bright light over the cherry blossoms outside, a heavy, suffocating gloom settled over the Su household. Forensic investigators began their preliminary examination of the scene and the body. They quickly established a rough timeline, estimating that Su Yuji had died sometime between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. the previous night. The immediate Glaring cause of death appeared to be acute poisoning. The telltale signs were all present: the foaming at the mouth, the specific rigidity of the muscles, and a distinct, sharp chemical odor lingering in the air. However, investigators immediately noticed a bizarre and highly suspicious detail. Despite the freezing temperatures of a late February night in Guizhou, the victim was found wearing nothing but a pair of short underwear. His shirt and trousers were entirely missing from the scene. In criminal investigations, an anomaly like missing clothing often suggests that a physical struggle took place, or that the perpetrator removed the garments to destroy forensic evidence, such as transfer DNA or blood spatter. Scanning the immediate vicinity where the victim had collapsed, crime scene technicians discovered a ceramic teacup that had been knocked over, rolling into a dark corner of the living room. When an officer carefully retrieved the cup and brought it close, the pungent, unmistakable smell of agricultural pesticide hit his nose. This organophosphate compound was highly toxic, confirming that the cup was the delivery method for the lethal dose. Strangely, on the nearby wooden table, the rest of the tea set remained perfectly arranged. The teapot and the other cups were turned upside down, completely clean and showing absolutely no signs of use. As the technicians meticulously bagged evidence, a sudden, chilling voice broke the silence in the room. It was Su Yuda, the victim's younger brother. Pointing a trembling finger into the empty air, he blurted out, "The black ghost did it. It wasn't me. Is he dead yet?" This bizarre outburst immediately caught the attention of the lead detectives. They quickly learned from the neighbors that Su Yuda suffered from severe mental disabilities due to a childhood illness. He operated at the cognitive level of a young child. While his words seemed like the nonsensical rambling of a disabled man, seasoned investigators know that such individuals often mimic or repeat exactly what they have witnessed, unfiltered by adult rationalization. The autopsy results added a shocking new layer to the mystery. While the pesticide in his system was undoubtedly lethal, the medical examiner found deep, dark ligature marks wrapped entirely around Su Yuji's neck. The forensic sequence of events became clear. The victim had been violently strangled first, likely rendering him helpless or unconscious, before the killer forced the foul-smelling pesticide down his throat. Furthermore, a thorough search of the house yielded no pesticide bottles or containers, completely ruling out any lingering theories of suicide. This was a calculated, brutal murder. But a critical logistical problem remained. How did the killer gain access to the house in the middle of the night without waking the wife or the brother? A complete inspection of the doors and windows revealed absolutely no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact, and the window frames were untouched. In behavioral analysis, a lack of forced entry almost always points to one of two scenarios. Either the killer possessed a key, or the victim willingly opened the door to someone they knew and trusted. To unravel this tangled web, detectives needed to understand the intricate dynamics of the household. They began by conducting a formal, sit-down interview with the only fully lucid survivor in the home, the grieving widow, Liao Menchu. According to her official statement, her relationship with the victim was relatively new. They had married in April of 2002 and subsequently moved into the house in Muir Village to start their lives together. Initially, their marriage was filled with hope. However, tragedy struck just 4 months later. In August of 2002, Su Yuzi was involved in a severe accident while at work. Although he survived, the physical trauma left him permanently weakened. He could no longer perform the heavy manual labor required to maintain his previous income. This tragic shift forced Liao Mincho to step up and become the primary breadwinner for the family. She secured a grueling job at a local manufacturing plant, working long hours to keep them financially afloat. Adding to their domestic strain was the presence of Su Yuda. After his childhood fever, the younger brother was left mentally stunted. When he was calm, he was harmless, but he frequently suffered from severe behavioral outbursts, throwing tantrums, breaking objects, and screaming at the top of his lungs. Because of this, the family was often forced to lock him in his own separate bedroom for his own safety and theirs. Originally, Su Yuda had lived in a distant rural county with his elderly parents. However, showing a remarkable depth of empathy, Liao Mingqiu had suggested to her husband that they bring the disabled brother to live with them, sparing the aging parents the heavy burden. Su Yuji was deeply moved by his wife's sacrifice and kindness. According to neighbors, this act solidified their bond, and everyone in the village viewed them as an incredibly loving and resilient couple. Even when Su Yuzi became disabled himself, Liao Mingqiu never complained, shouldering the financial and caregiving responsibilities with stoic grace. When asked to recount the events of February 23rd, the night before the murder, Liao Mingqiu stated that she had been forced to work a mandatory overtime shift at the factory. She did not return home until nearly 10 p.m. Exhausted from the manual labor, she wanted nothing more than to sleep. She recalled that her husband was in unusually high spirits that evening. He warmly heated up her dinner and sat with her while she ate. He assured her that he had already fed his younger brother and given him his medication, noting that Su Yuda was fast asleep in his locked room. Liao Mingqiu told investigators that after finishing her meal, she excused herself to go to bed, while her husband volunteered to wash the dishes. She claimed to have fallen into a deep, uninterrupted sleep the moment her head hit the pillow. She stated she slept straight through the night until the following morning. Upon waking up, she noticed her husband was not in bed. Groggy and confused, she walked out into the living room, tripped over something heavy in the dim morning light, and fell to the floor. When she looked back to see what she had stumbled over, she found herself staring directly into the lifeless, bulging eyes of her husband. Her ensuing screams were what alerted the Lee family next door. Investigators carefully analyzed her statement. If her timeline was accurate, the killer must have entered the home between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Because there was no forced entry, detectives strongly suspected that Su Yushi had quietly let a friend or acquaintance into the house, perhaps to avoid waking his exhausted wife. Yet, Liao Mingqiu's narrative left her without any corroborating alibi. She was asleep in the next room, while her husband was strangled and poisoned. In homicide investigations, the spouse is always the primary suspect until definitively ruled out. However, police had to tread carefully. Interviews with the immediate neighbors, particularly Lee Miexen, corroborated the image of a perfectly happy marriage. The neighbors testified that they never heard the couple argue. The only disturbances ever to come from the house were the loud, violent tantrums of the disabled brother. Given the seemingly perfect marriage and the lack of any apparent motive for the wife, detectives pivoted their focus outward. They hypothesized that someone from Su Yuji's past, perhaps harboring a deep-seated grudge, had visited him that night. The killer, welcomed inside, struck when the victim's guard was down, strangling him, forcing him to ingest the poison, and then bizarrely stripping him of his clothes before fleeing into the night. Detectives asked Liao Mingqiu to detail her husband's social circle. She admitted she knew very little about his friends, but she did recall one significant detail. Before his crippling accident, Su Yushi had been involved in a joint business venture with a group of associates. One of these men was named Lin Tong. Liao Mingqiu remembered her husband once vaguely implying that his horrific workplace accident was somehow the fault of this specific group of men. Armed with a name and a potential motive involving money and physical injury, the investigative team tracked down Lin Tong at a local construction site. When brought in for questioning, Lin Tong appeared genuinely shocked by the news of the murder. He adamantly denied any involvement, stating he had not seen the victim in nearly 2 months. Lin Tong openly admitted to the business partnership. He explained that 2 months after the accident, in October of 2002, Su Yuji had called him, stating he could no longer participate in the venture and demanded his investment capital back. Because the funds were already tied up in the business, the partners could only liquidate and return 80% of the money, which was equivalent to several $1,000s today. The remaining 20% was withheld as a penalty for the early withdrawal. According to Lin Tong, Su Yuji accepted these terms without any argument. To verify his alibi, police checked with Lin Tong's co-workers. Multiple witnesses confirmed that from 8 p.m. on the night of the murder until the following morning, Lin Tong was drinking heavily with his crew at their dormitory. They fell asleep together and woke up together, giving him a rock-solid alibi. Furthermore, Lin Tong provided a disturbing piece of psychological context. He claimed that during his last visit to the victim in December, Su Yuji was severely depressed. He felt like a useless burden to his hard-working wife, expressed a desire for a divorce so she could find a better man, and mentioned sending his disabled brother back to their parents. This testimony suggested that Su Yuji was suicidal, yet the forensic evidence, the strangulation marks, the missing clothes, and the missing poison bottle screamed of a violent homicide. The investigation had hit a brick wall, leaving detectives with a staged crime scene, a disabled witness babbling about a black ghost, and a loving widow with a perfect facade. For 2 agonizing months, the investigation into the brutal murder of Su Yuji remained entirely stagnant. The oppressive weight of the unsolved case hung over the Huaxi District Police Department. The initial theories involving revenge from former business partners had evaporated, leaving detectives grasping at shadows. Spring in Guizhou province slowly began to yield to the warmer, more humid days of early summer. The cherry blossoms that had framed the gruesome crime scene in the village had long since fallen to the earth, replaced by dense, suffocating green foliage. On the morning of April 7th, 2003, Detective Zhao Muyan was driving through the outskirts of the rural town on an entirely unrelated assignment. As he navigated the winding dirt roads, a familiar, tragic figure caught his eye. Stumbling along the shoulder of the road was Su Yuda, the mentally disabled younger brother of the murder victim. But the man the detective saw now was a mere shadow of the person from 2 months prior. Su Yuda was severely emaciated, his cheekbones jutting out sharply from his pale, unwashed face. He was dressed only in a pair of filthy, ragged shorts and a torn, short-sleeved cotton shirt, shivering slightly despite the mild weather. In his trembling hand, he loosely clutched a single, wilted red wildflower. He was wandering aimlessly, flashing a vacant, foolish smile at passing vehicles, begging for scraps of food from strangers. The sight struck a deep chord of pity within the seasoned detective. This was the vulnerable brother whom the so-called loving widow, Liao Mincho, had sworn to protect. Zhao Muyan immediately pulled his vehicle over, gently approached the distressed man, and guided him into the passenger seat of his cruiser. He drove them to a small, bustling local diner nearby to buy the starving man a hot, nourishing meal. It was within the grease-stained walls of this unassuming eatery that the stagnant murder case would suddenly break wide open. As Su Yuda voraciously devoured the bowls of hot noodles placed in front of him, the middle-aged female owner of the diner approached the detective's table, recognizing Zhao Muyan from the weeks the police had swarmed the village. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She revealed a startling transformation in the household dynamic of the Su family since the murder. According to the observant diner owner and the collective whispers of the neighborhood, the grieving widow's mask of devotion had slipped entirely. Liao Minchu no longer cared for her disabled brother-in-law. She frequently refused to bathe him or dress him appropriately for the weather, allowing him to wander the village like an abandoned stray. When concerned neighbors attempted to intervene or gently remind her of her domestic duties, Liao Mincho would erupt in bitter irritation, cursing at them to mind their own business. Even more disturbingly, several neighbors had witnessed her locking the disabled man out of the house at night, forcing him to sleep on the cold, hard ground of the open courtyard. But the most damning piece of local gossip involved Liao Minchu's romantic life. As soon as the police presence in the village had dwindled, the supposedly heartbroken widow began bringing a strange man to the house to spend the night. In the conservative, tightly knit rural community, a single man and a newly widowed woman spending the night together behind closed doors was not viewed as a simple platonic arrangement. Detective Zhao Muyan listened with mounting astonishment. This behavior entirely contradicted the psychological profile the investigative team had built for Liao Minchu. During the initial interviews, she had presented herself as the ultimate martyr, a selfless, deeply loving wife who carried the weight of her disabled husband and his disabled brother without a single complaint. Now, just weeks after her husband was violently strangled and poisoned, she was publicly abusing the brother she had once claimed to love and entertaining a new lover in the very bed she had shared with the victim. The sudden, drastic shift in Liao Minchu's behavior provided a glaring, undeniable motive: freedom and lust. The possibility that she had orchestrated her husband's murder to escape her burdensome life and pursue a new romance was now the central theory. Zhao Muyan rushed back to the precinct, urgently briefing the lead investigative team on these new, explosive developments. A squad of plainclothes detectives was immediately dispatched to the manufacturing plant where Liao Minchu worked. Their goal was to identify the mysterious lover without alerting the suspects. Upon infiltrating the factory floor and discreetly interviewing her co-workers, the police quickly identified the man in question. His name was Song Jibing. Song Jibing was a 32-year-old bachelor who had migrated from the sprawling municipality of Chongqing. He had transferred to the local factory in July of 2002, just 1 month before the tragic workplace accident that had crippled Su Yuji. According to the factory workers, Song Jibing was charismatic, notoriously handsome, and possessed a smooth, humorous personality that made him incredibly popular among the female staff. When detectives pressed the factory workers about the timeline of the relationship, the official consensus was that Song Jibing and Liao Minchu had only started dating after the husband's tragic death. However, one veteran female employee, reading between the lines of workplace politics, pulled a detective aside. She expressed her strong, intuitive belief that the pair had been carrying on a clandestine affair long before the murder occurred. They had simply been exceptionally careful not to display their affection publicly on the factory floor. The puzzle pieces were aligning perfectly. If Liao Minchu and Song Jibing were locked in a passionate, secret affair, the disabled, financially dependent husband was a massive obstacle. Furthermore, if they committed the crime together, it perfectly explained the forensic mystery at the crime scene. The victim would have readily opened his door for his wife's charming co-worker, having absolutely no idea of the betrayal waiting in the shadows. The terrifying ghost that the mentally disabled brother had seen could very well have been Song Jibing slipping out of the house. On the late afternoon of April 7th, the investigative unit descended upon Song Jibing's private rented residence. When they pushed open the door, their suspicions were visually confirmed. Sitting comfortably inside the apartment was the supposedly grieving widow, Liao Minchu. When confronted by the sudden influx of stern-faced detectives, she visibly panicked, her face flushing crimson as she stammered out a barrage of unsolicited explanations about how they were just friends discussing work matters. The police were not interested in her frantic excuses. Both individuals were immediately apprehended, placed in separate patrol vehicles, and transported to the precinct for intensive, isolated interrogation. Night had fallen by the time the interrogations commenced. Inside the damp, dimly lit questioning rooms of the local station, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The harsh glare of the overhead lights cast deep, dramatic shadows across the suspects' faces. In the first interrogation room, Liao Minchu desperately attempted to maintain her facade of innocence. Weeping softly, she swore to the detectives that her relationship with Song Jibing had only blossomed from a place of shared grief. She claimed that after her husband's sudden passing, she was entirely broken and overwhelmed. Song Jibing, being a kind co-worker, had simply stepped in to offer emotional support and help her navigate her darkest hours. According to her narrative, His constant presence eventually ignited a spark of romance, but she vehemently denied any inappropriate contact prior to the murder. Meanwhile, in the adjacent room, Song Jibing proved to be a cool, calculated adversary. He completely denied any knowledge of or involvement in the murder. When pressed about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, February 23rd, he laid out a meticulously detailed alibi that seemed virtually impenetrable. According to his official statement, he had been mandated to work a late overtime shift at the factory that Sunday evening. He claimed he did not clock out until exactly 11 at night. Exhausted and hungry, he walked from the factory gates to a small, late-night food stall located just a few blocks away. He sat down, ordered a hot meal, and ate leisurely. Afterward, he retrieved his bicycle and began the long pedal back to his rented apartment. Along the dark, winding route, he specifically recalled crossing paths with the factory's night security guard, who was just arriving to begin his rounds. They exchanged brief greetings. Song Jibing stated that he finally arrived at his own home just before midnight. If this detailed timeline was accurate, Song Jibing was legally untouchable. The medical examiner had placed the time of death between 11 at night and 1 in the morning. To execute the murder, Song Jibing would have had to leave his job, travel miles to the village, gain entry to the house, physically overpower and strangle the victim, force him to drink pesticide, undress the corpse, clean the scene, and travel all the way back to his own neighborhood, all within a practically non-existent window of time. The detectives immediately hit the pavement to dismantle his story, praying they would find a fatal flaw. However, every stone they turned only seemed to solidify the suspect's defense. First, they seized the official punch cards and logbooks from the factory manager. The time cards confirmed the statements. Liao Minchu had clocked out at 40 minutes past 9 at night, while Song Jibing had indeed clocked out exactly at 11 at night. Next, they interviewed the owner of the late-night food stall. The vendor distinctly remembered Song Jibing coming in late that night, ordering food, and staying to eat. Then, they tracked down the factory security guard. The guard confirmed without a shadow of a doubt that he had seen Song Jibing riding his bicycle in the opposite direction of the victim's village, somewhere between 11 at night and midnight. Finally, the detectives knocked on the door of Song Jibing's immediate neighbor. The elderly man reported that he had woken up late that night to use the restroom. He explicitly remembered looking out his window and seeing Song Jibing returning home, noting that the lights in the apartment flicked on just minutes before midnight. The investigative team reconstructed the geographical timeline, the bicycle ride from the factory to the diner, the time spent eating, and the journey back to his apartment would take a man roughly 40 minutes. This perfectly matched the window between his clock-out time and his arrival home before midnight. He had absolutely zero unaccounted time to travel the extra 30 minutes each way to the victim's village and commit a complex homicide. The detectives were infuriated. Their primary suspect had an alibi carved from solid granite, but the discrepancies did not end with the timeline. There was another glaring contradiction involving the only eyewitness to the aftermath of the crime. When the witnesses at the factory and the food stall described Song Jibing that night, they all noted a specific detail. He was wearing his bright red factory uniform jacket. The evening was cold, and it was the only heavy coat he owned. However, the victim's disabled brother, Su Yuda, had repeatedly babbled to the police about seeing a massive black ghost. If Song Jibing was the killer, he would have been wearing his bright red jacket, unless he had somehow managed to go home, change into a black outfit, bike all the way to the village, commit the murder, and bike back without anyone noticing. He could not possibly be the Black Ghost. Faced with a dead end, a controversial proposal was raised within the precinct. A junior detective suggested they needed to formally re-interview the mentally disabled brother. This idea was met with fierce resistance from senior officers. They argued that Su Yuda had the cognitive function of a toddler. His brain was damaged. His statements were legally inadmissible, and relying on the ramblings of a man who hallucinates ghosts was a profound waste of police resources. Despite the heated arguments, the lead investigator authorized the interview. It was a desperate move, but they had no other leads to chase. Bringing Tsuyuda into the intimidating environment of the police station proved to be a monumental challenge. The harsh lights, the uniforms, and the unfamiliar faces sent the disabled man into a state of sheer panic. He thrashed, cried out, and refused to sit in the metal chair. It took the detectives nearly an hour of speaking softly, offering him sweet snacks, and treating him with the gentle patience one would afford a frightened child, before he finally calmed down enough to communicate. Instead of launching into aggressive questioning about the night of the murder, the interrogating officer started small, asking simple, comforting questions about things Tsuyuda liked. Once a fragile rapport was established, the detective carefully steered the conversation toward the fatal night. The detective lied smoothly, his voice a soothing hum, stating that they had caught the black ghost, but needed help remembering what it looked like. The mere mention of the word ghost caused an immediate physical reaction. Tsuyuda's eyes widened in sheer terror. He shrank back into his chair, his head darting nervously from side to side, as if expecting the phantom to burst through the interrogation room wall. He shouted that it was big, that it looked at him from the door, and that it wore very scary black clothes. As he was shouting, Tsuyuda suddenly stopped. His wide eyes locked onto an object resting on the detective's metal table. He pointed a shaking, dirt-caked finger at it. He breathlessly exclaimed that the ghost was exactly that black color. The detectives in the room froze. The air in the interrogation room suddenly felt heavy, thick with a shocking realization. They all turned their heads to stare at the object Tsuyuda was frantically pointing at. It was the lead investigator's personal incident logbook, and the cover of the notebook was not black. It was a bright, vivid crimson red. To confirm the breathtaking hypothesis that had just exploded in their minds, the detectives quickly scrambled to find a standardized color wheel chart. They initiated a makeshift game with the disabled man, asking him to identify the colors on the board. Tsuyuda eagerly participated. He correctly identified blue, green, yellow, and white without a moment of hesitation. But the moment the detective pointed to the black square, Tsuyuda confidently stated it was red. And when the detective pointed to the bright red square, Tsuyuda shrank back, whispering that it was the terrifying black color. The cognitive damage from his childhood fever had left him with a severe, highly specific form of colorblindness. He neurologically swapped red and black. The massive, terrifying black ghost that had stood in the doorway watching him after murdering his brother had not been wearing black at all. The killer was wearing a bright red jacket, the exact color of Song Jibing's factory uniform. The physical evidence was slowly aligning, but the impossibly tight timeline of the night of the murder still stood like an impenetrable fortress, protecting a killer who was inches away from walking free. The investigative team was caught in an agonizing paradox. The psychological profiling, the circumstantial evidence, and the groundbreaking revelation regarding the disabled brother's colorblindness pointed squarely at Song Jibing. The terrifying black ghost was, in reality, a man wearing the bright red uniform jacket of the local manufacturing plant. Yet, the physical paper trail and the sworn testimonies of multiple independent witnesses created an ironclad alibi for the night of February 23rd. In the realm of criminal justice, a solid, corroborated alibi will always override circumstantial theories. The detectives knew they had to dismantle Song Jibing's timeline minute by agonizing minute, or a brutal killer would undoubtedly walk free. They began by hauling the factory manager back into the precinct, demanding a physical forensic audit of the mechanical punch card system. The heavy paper cards were laid out under the harsh fluorescent lights of the squad room. The purple ink stamps were undeniable, Liao Minchu had punched out at exactly 40 minutes past 9 o'clock in the evening. Song Zhibing had punched out at exactly 11 o'clock at night. The mechanical timestamps showed absolutely no signs of tampering. The machine was functioning perfectly. Next, the detectives re-interviewed the night shift security guard. They brought him to the exact spot on the dark, winding dirt road where he claimed to have crossed paths with the suspect. They made him recreate the lighting conditions, the angle of approach, and the verbal exchange. The guard remained fiercely resolute. He was absolutely certain he had seen Song Zhibing pedaling his bicycle away from the factory and toward the suspect's residential district. He placed the encounter squarely in the window between 11 o'clock at night and midnight. Finally, they revisited the elderly neighbor who lived adjacent to Song Zhibing. The old man retraced his steps, explaining how an overactive bladder had woken him up in the middle of the night. He had looked through the gaps in his wooden window shutters and saw the suspect arriving home. He distinctly remembered checking his mechanical alarm clock. It was roughly 15 minutes before midnight. The light in the suspect's apartment flicked on, confirming his arrival and settling him in for the night. The timeline was suffocatingly tight. If Song Zhibing clocked out at 11 o'clock, spent 20 minutes eating at the local diner, and then spent another 20 minutes cycling home, his arrival time of 1/4 to midnight made perfect geographical and chronological sense. He possessed absolutely no unaccounted gap in his schedule to travel the additional 30 minutes to Moore Village, execute a complex and physically demanding murder, and return home without being noticed. The detectives stared at the crime board, their eyes burning from exhaustion. There was only one link in the chain that felt slightly fragile: the elderly woman who owned the late-night food stall. During her initial interviews, she had been adamant about the timeline, but her demeanor had possessed a subtle, underlying hesitation when pressed for specifics. The lead detective decided to pull her back in for a deeply focused cognitive interview. Sitting in the quiet, sterile environment of the police station, far away from the grease and noise of her diner, the elderly woman was asked to mentally walk through every single second of that night. The detective urged her to close her eyes and recall the smells, the ambient sounds, and the exact flow of the conversation. She recounted that she had been preparing to close her stall for the evening. The streets were dead quiet. She explicitly remembered reaching out and turning off her small, battery-operated radio at exactly 11 o'clock at night because her favorite evening broadcast had just concluded. Mere moments later, Song Zhibing walked out of the cold night air and stepped under the canvas awning of her stall. He ordered a large, steaming bowl of hot noodles and sat down on a plastic stool. The detective leaned forward, asking her to recall his exact words. The woman furrowed her brow, digging deep into her memory. She explained that Song Zhibing did not just eat his food in silence and leave. Instead, he lingered. He slurped his noodles slowly and intentionally struck up a conversation with her. He complained bitterly about the harsh realities of factory work and the high cost of living. Then, he made a very specific, deliberate statement. He looked at her and said that today was the 23rd of the month and he only had a few more days to survive until the end of the month payday. He lamented his tight budget and the difficulty of making ends meet. Being a kind, maternal figure, the old woman had felt a sudden surge of sympathy. She spent the next 10 minutes lecturing the young man on the virtues of frugality and the importance of saving money for emergencies. They had a pleasant, engaging chat before he finally paid for his meal and pedaled away into the darkness. The seasoned detective felt a cold chill run down his spine. He recognized the manipulative tactic immediately. Song Zhibing had not been making idle small talk. He was planting a psychological seed. He was artificially anchoring the specific date, the 23rd, into the mind of an elderly woman whose memory was naturally fading. He wanted her to remember him, and more importantly, he desperately needed her to strongly associate his face with that specific calendar date. It was a textbook example of a psychopath manufacturing an alibi through premeditated social engineering. The detective carefully pressed the woman on why she was initially so confident about the date when the police first questioned her. She admitted, with a profound sense of guilt, that she actually rarely kept track of the calendar days. The days all blended together in the exhausting routine of running a food stall. The only reason she confidently told the police it was the 23rd was because Song Jibing had explicitly and repeatedly told her it was the 23rd during their conversation over the noodles. This revelation severely fractured the foundation of the alibi, but the police needed hard, undeniable proof to legally shatter it in a court of law. The detective's mind raced back to the very beginning of her narrative. He asked her about the radio. He asked for the specific name of the program she had turned off right before the suspect arrived at the stall. The old woman smiled fondly, relieved to talk about something simple and comforting. It was a local cultural storytelling program, her absolute favorite show on the airwaves. She provided the exact name of the local broadcasting station and the title of the segment. The detective immediately dispatched a junior officer to contact the regional broadcasting network. The station manager checked the official programming logs and provided a piece of forensic information that would instantly send Song Jibing to death row. The cultural storytelling program the elderly woman listened to was heavily syndicated. It only aired once a week. It was exclusively broadcast on Saturday nights. The detectives frantically checked their calendars. February 23rd, 2003, the night of the brutal murder, was a Sunday. The implication was staggering. Song Jibing had indeed visited the food stall, eaten hot noodles, chatted with the old woman about saving money, and run into the security guard on his way home. But all of these events had actually taken place on the night of Saturday, February 22nd. He had executed a flawless dry run. He had meticulously planted his alibi a full 24 hours before he actually committed the murder, relying on the predictable routines of the people around him to build a wall of plausible deniability. When Sunday, February 23rd rolled around, Song Jibing clocked out of the factory at exactly 11 o'clock at night and vanished into the darkness. He never went to the diner. He rode his bicycle directly to Muir village. He had a solid 30 to 45-minute window to commit the atrocity before slipping back to his apartment under the cover of night, confident that the ghost of his Saturday night actions would protect him on Sunday. The brilliant, premeditated scheme had been completely unraveled by a simple weekly radio schedule. Armed with this devastating realization, the police moved with ruthless efficiency. Arrest warrants were drafted and signed by a judge within the hour. Heavily armed tactical units were dispatched simultaneously to the factory and Song Jibing's apartment. However, the suspect was nowhere to be found. A frantic, citywide dragnet was initiated. Plainclothes officers swarmed the local transit hubs, bus stations, and highway checkpoints. Late in the afternoon, keen-eyed investigators spotted Song Jibing at the Central Railway Station. He was standing near the edge of the platform, tightly gripping a small canvas duffel bag, anxiously waiting to board a locomotive headed far out of the Huaxi district. He had likely sensed the shifting tide of the investigation, perhaps noticing unmarked vehicles near his home, and decided to flee the province. Before he could even step over the yellow safety line to board the train, 4 detectives tackled him to the cold concrete platform. He offered no physical resistance. As the heavy steel cuffs clicked securely around his wrists, his charismatic, arrogant facade crumbled into dust. The confident gleam vanished from his eyes, replaced by the hollow, defeated stare of a man who realized his brilliant, murderous puzzle had finally been solved. Simultaneously, a separate unit kicked in the door of the residence in Muir village and arrested Liao Mingqiu. She collapsed into violent hysterics as the officers read her rights, parading her out of the courtyard in front of the very neighbor she had successfully deceived for months. The illusion of the grieving widow was shattered in front of the entire community. Back at the precinct, The atmosphere in the interrogation rooms had drastically shifted from the previous encounters. Confronted with the irrefutable radio broadcast evidence and the absolute collapse of the manufactured Saturday night alibi, Song Jibbing did not even attempt to lie. The psychological dam broke. He slumped in his metal chair and coldly, methodically confessed to everything. In the adjacent room, Liao Minche, informed by detectives that her lover had surrendered and implicated her, wept uncontrollably and corroborated the entire gruesome conspiracy. The true motive behind the murder of Su Yuji was a classic, deeply tragic tale of greed, lust, and ultimate betrayal. The nightmare began in the direct aftermath of the crippling workplace accident, when Liao Minchu was forced to become the sole financial provider for the household. The heavy burden of supporting a disabled husband and his mentally disabled brother quickly soured her spirit. The initial empathy and profound love she had demonstrated evaporated, replaced by a deep, festering resentment that consumed her daily thoughts. She grew disgusted by her husband's physical limitations and deeply hateful of the chaotic, noisy burden of her brother-in-law. However, Liao Mincho was acutely aware of her social standing in the conservative rural village. She was universally praised by the elders as a virtuous, self-sacrificing wife. To maintain this incredibly valuable reputation, she wore a mask of absolute devotion, smiling for the neighbors while quietly seething in the dark confines of her home. Her escape from this miserable reality manifested in the form of the newly transferred worker, Song Jiabing. What began as harmless, flirtatious banter over the roar of machinery on the factory floor rapidly escalated into an intense, highly secretive romantic affair. To facilitate their illicit encounters without raising the suspicions of her husband or the nosy villagers, Liao Mincho began aggressively signing up for excessive overtime shifts. These phantom shifts provided her with the perfect, unquestionable cover to spend hours locked in cheap, local motel rooms or Song Jiabing's private apartment. But her husband, Su Yushi, was not a foolish man. He was physically broken, but his cognitive abilities remained remarkably sharp. After the first full month of her supposed rigorous overtime schedule, he eagerly checked her official factory pay stub to see how much they had saved. The simple mathematics simply did not add up. The meager additional wages she received did not come close to matching the sheer volume of extra hours she claimed to be working on the assembly line. Furthermore, the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the lingering scents of unknown perfumed soap on her clothes, and the increasingly cruel, dismissive way she began treating his disabled brother behind closed doors painted a clear, agonizing picture. Through quiet observation and fragments of careless factory gossip that eventually reached his ears, Su Yuji deduced the heartbreaking truth. His beloved wife was engaging in a passionate affair. Yet, in an act of profound, tragic self-deprecation, the disabled man chose absolute silence. He was paralyzed by immense guilt. He genuinely believed that his crippled body had ruined her bright future. He felt that he was a worthless anchor dragging down a vibrant young woman who deserved better. Because of this deeply ingrained sense of total inadequacy, he swallowed his pride, endured the emotional betrayal and agonizing silence, and never once confronted her about the infidelity. Unfortunately, his silent suffering was not nearly enough for the two lovers. Liao Minchu and Song Jiabing did not just want to sneak around in the shadows. They wanted absolute freedom, and they wanted it without the social stigma and financial ruin of a messy, public divorce. Furthermore, they wanted to permanently claim the house in Muir Village and any remaining financial compensation the victim possessed from his accident. The disabled, guilt-ridden husband and his bothersome brother were completely viewed as obstacles that needed to be permanently eradicated from their lives. In early February, sitting in the dark corners of the factory warehouse while the machines hummed, the adulterous couple finalized their chilling, blood-soaked pact. They would murder Su Yuji, stage the crime scene to look like a tragic, inexplicable poisoning, send the disabled brother away to a state-run asylum, and eventually emerge as a publicly grieving widow who naturally found solace in the arms of a supportive coworker. It was a masterclass in sociopathic planning, completely devoid of basic human empathy, leading directly to the fatal night of February 23rd. The meticulous timeline constructed by the investigative team brought the horrifying reality of Sunday, February 23rd, 2003, into agonizing focus. As the night enveloped Moore Village in a blanket of suffocating darkness, a deadly trap was being carefully laid within the seemingly peaceful walls of the Su household. Liao Mingchu arrived home from her shift at the manufacturing plant at exactly 10 o'clock at night. She stepped through the wooden front doors, shedding her heavy winter coat, and immediately slipping back into the practiced role of the devoted, exhausted wife. Her husband, Su Yuji, was waiting up for her in the dimly lit living room, a warm meal already prepared and resting on the dining table. As they sat together to eat, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension. Su Yuji, despite his physical ailments, tried to engage his wife in gentle conversation, entirely unaware that the woman sitting across from him was quietly counting down the minutes to his execution. To justify the impending arrival of her lover in the middle of the night, Liao Mingchu casually planted a fabricated excuse. She told her husband that she had accidentally left an important personal item back at the factory locker room. She claimed that a kind male coworker, who lived in the same general direction, had generously offered to swing by their house to drop the item off on his way home from his own late shift. Su Yuji, trusting and appreciative as always, thought nothing of it. With the psychological bait successfully set, Liao Mingchu excused herself to the washroom to bathe, asking her husband to keep an ear out for the door. The hands of the mechanical clock in the living room slowly ticked toward 11:15 at night. Outside, the frigid February wind rustled through the barren branches of the cherry trees. Finally, a soft, deliberate knock echoed against the heavy wooden front door. Su Yuji painfully pushed himself up from his chair and slowly made his way to the entryway. He unlatched the heavy iron lock and pulled the door open, greeting Song Jiabing with a warm, welcoming smile. It is a profoundly tragic detail that the disabled husband, entirely oblivious to the sinister romantic affair, politely invited his own murderer out of the cold and into the warmth of his home. Hearing the voices in the living room, Liao Mingchu immediately emerged from the back hallway. She greeted Song Jiabing with feigned polite surprise and quickly offered to prepare a round of hot tea to warm the guest before he had to continue his journey back to his apartment. She retreated into the small kitchen, her back turned to the two men sitting awkwardly in the living room. It was in the shadows of the kitchen that she pulled a small, concealed glass vial of highly toxic agricultural pesticide from her pocket. With trembling hands, she uncorked the vial and poured the lethal chemical directly into the porcelain teacup designated for her husband. She carried the wooden tray back into the living room, placing the cups down on the low table. She pushed the poisoned cup directly toward Su Yuji. However, the meticulously planned, silent assassination immediately encountered a fatal flaw. Organophosphate pesticides emit a very distinct, harsh, and pungent chemical odor similar to rotting garlic or sulfur. As Su Yuji raised the ceramic cup toward his lips, the noxious fumes hit his nose. His survival instincts instantly flared. He hesitated, lowering the cup back down to the table. He looked at his wife, confusion clouding his eyes, perhaps silently questioning the foul smell, not wanting to appear rude to their guest, but entirely unwilling to drink the foul-smelling liquid. Su Yuji politely pushed his cup across the table toward Song Jiabing, offering his portion to the cold, tired factory worker. In that fraction of a second, the carefully laid plans of the adulterous couple shattered. They realized they could not quietly poison him without a physical struggle. The silent assassination had failed, and an overwhelming wave of sheer panic and violent adrenaline consumed them both. Liao Minchu, standing slightly behind her seated husband, made the first move. Operating entirely on desperate, murderous instinct, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a long, thin strip of dense cotton fabric she had prepared, and lunged forward. She threw the makeshift ligature over Su Yuzi's head, pulling the fabric violently backward against his throat. The disabled man let out a choked gasp, his hands desperately flying up to claw at the fabric, biting deeply into his neck. Despite his weakened physical state from the accident, the sheer terror of the ambush gave him a sudden, violent burst of adrenaline. He thrashed wildly against the wooden chair, trying to break free from his wife's ruthless grip. Seeing the victim resisting, Song Jibing leapt from his seat. He lunged across the small table, his large hands grabbing handfuls of the fabric of Su Yuxi's shirt. He pinned the struggling man downward with brutal, overwhelming force. With his free hand, Song Jibing grabbed the ceramic teacup filled with the lethal agricultural pesticide. As Liao Mincho maintained the suffocating pressure on the victim's airway from behind, forcing him to gasp for breath, Song Jibing violently jammed the rim of the cup against Su Yuxi's lips. He poured the foul, burning liquid directly down the screaming man's throat, forcing him to swallow the toxic compound. The struggle was brief but incredibly violent. Between the brutal asphyxiation from the ligature and the immediate, devastating neurological effects of the lethal pesticide entering his bloodstream, Su Yuxi's body quickly gave out. His desperate thrashing slowed to weak, spastic tremors, and finally, he collapsed lifelessly onto the cold wooden floorboards, knocking over the teacup and spilling the remaining poison into the dark corners of the room. The two killers stood over the body, their chests heaving, adrenaline pounding in their ears. They had succeeded, but the scene was a chaotic disaster. It was at this exact moment that Song Jibing looked down at his own hands and realized he had made a catastrophic forensic error. During the violent physical struggle, he had grabbed the victim by his shirt, twisting the fabric tightly in his fists to pin him down. Song Jibing suddenly became terrified that he had left microscopic fibers, skin cells, or perhaps even distinct fingerprints on the victim's clothing. In the early 2000s, forensic science was rapidly advancing, and the fear of leaving trace evidence panicked the amateur killer. Acting entirely on terrified impulse, Song Jibing rolled the heavy corpse over and frantically began to strip the clothing from Su Yuxi's body. He pulled the shirt and the trousers off the victim, leaving the dead man completely exposed on the floor, wearing nothing but his short underwear. He bundled the clothing tightly into his arms, deciding he would dispose of the garments somewhere deep in the woods along his bicycle route home. While he handled the clothing, Liao Minchu rushed to grab a damp rag. She frantically wiped down the table, righted the tip chairs, and hastily rearranged the unused teacups to create the bizarre, staged scene the police would later find the next morning. Suddenly, a sharp thud echoed from the back hallway, shattering the frantic silence. Both killers froze, their blood turning to ice. The noise had come directly from the locked bedroom of Su Yuda. The violent commotion in the living room, the crashing of chairs, and the muffled screams of the victim had pierced the thin wooden walls and violently awakened the mentally disabled brother. Song Jibing dropped the bundle of clothes and crept silently down the dark hallway. He slowly pushed the bedroom door open just a fraction of an inch, peering into the pitch-black room. Through the narrow sliver of the doorway, Song Jibing stared directly at Su Yuda, who was sitting upright in his bed, wide awake and trembling in the darkness. Because of his severe colorblindness, when Su Yuda stared back at the towering figure standing in his doorway, he did not see the bright red fabric of the factory uniform. In the dim light, his damaged brain processed the crimson color as a deep, terrifying black. He saw a massive, silent black ghost staring at him through the crack in the door, a traumatic visual image that would haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately become the key to solving his brother's murder. Song Jibing stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, debating whether he needed to kill the disabled witness to protect himself. But Liao Minchu quietly stepped up behind him and placed a hand on his shoulder. She whispered frantically that her brother-in-law was severely mentally damaged, that he had the mind of an infant, and that the police would never believe a single word he said. Taking her word for it, Song Jiabing backed away from the door. He grabbed the bundle of the victim's clothing, slipped out the front door, and vanished into the freezing February night. He rode his bicycle furiously back toward his apartment, strategically tossing the bundled clothing into a deep, overgrown ravine along the dirt road, miles away from the village. By the time he crossed paths with the factory security guard, he had perfectly positioned himself to validate his meticulously planned Saturday night alibi. Back at the house, Liao Minchu finished wiping the floor, crawled into her empty bed, and pulled the covers up to her chin, waiting for the sun to rise so she could perform the role of the traumatized widow finding her husband's body. Their plan was exceptionally ruthless, calculated with a chilling degree of sociopathic precision. They had accounted for almost every variable, manipulated the memories of innocent bystanders, and staged a confusing, terrifying crime scene. Yet, they had fundamentally underestimated the dedication of the Huaxi district detectives and completely failed to account for the unique neurological condition of the one disabled man they deemed too foolish to be a threat. The overwhelming weight of the physical evidence, combined with their detailed, matching confessions, left absolutely no room for a legal defense. The trial of Song Jiabing and Liao Minchu was a swift and highly publicized affair. The community that had once praised the widow for her steadfast devotion now packed the courtroom gallery to look upon her with absolute disgust. The prosecution painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a woman who traded the life of her loyal husband for a fleeting romance and financial greed. The judicial panel showed no leniency for such a calculated, intimate betrayal. Both Song Jiabing and Liao Minchu were found guilty of capital murder in the first degree. They were subsequently sentenced to death. After exhausting their rapid, mandatory legal appeals, the sentences were carried out. In May of 2003, barely 3 months after they snuffed out the life of Su Yuji, both murderers were executed by the state, effectively closing the dark chapter on Mu'er village. The tragic ripples of the crime, however, extended far beyond the perpetrators. The family of Su Yuji was left entirely devastated. The civil courts ordered that the families of the murderers pay a substantial sum of financial compensation, equating to tens of thousands of dollars today, to the victims' grieving parents. But no amount of currency could replace their murdered son. The most heartbreaking casualty of the entire ordeal was Su Yuda, stripped of the brother who had loved him and protected him, and deeply traumatized by the terrifying events he witnessed. He could no longer remain in the village. He was quietly sent back to his elderly, frail parents in the distant countryside, carrying with him the lifelong psychological scars of the black ghost in the doorway. The case of Mu'er village remains a stark, chilling reminder of the darkest capabilities of the human heart. It showcases how quickly a vow of lifelong devotion can rot into a conspiracy of murder when infected by greed and lust. True justice is rarely poetic, and it rarely undoes the immense damage inflicted upon the innocent. But the relentless pursuit of the truth ensures that even the most meticulously crafted shadows eventually succumb to the light. In the end, the meticulously planned murder of Su Yuji proves that no matter how clever the criminals believe they are, a single overlooked detail can bring down an entire empire of lies. If you found yourselves captivated by this deep dive into criminal psychology and forensic investigation, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe the death penalty was the absolute right call for both the mastermind and the accomplice? Or should the widow have faced a different fate? Let us know your theories down in the comments below.